Thank you, Tim. I always forget. Hello, and welcome to tonight's program sponsored by Channing Memorial Church. I'm Susan Kuronsky. I'm the chair of the Learning Center at Channing Church. As most of you know, Channing's a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Our humanistic spiritual focus leads us to be curious about many topics and committed to important causes. The Learning Center, the church's adult education committee, has arranged for Christian McBurney, noted historian and author, to present tonight's program, The Battle of Rhode Island. Mr. McBurney will present for about 40 minutes and will welcome questions at the end. You can write your questions anytime into the chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So that TLC may continue to bring you continuing quality programming, we would be grateful for a maybe $5 suggested free will offering to help defray costs. Our expenses include honoraria, equipment, and other program expenses like advertising. If so inclined, you may make the donation by using the TLC button under Give on the Channing Memorial Church website. And there are 2 Channing Memorial churches. Be sure you note the one in Newport. Many thanks.
Thanks, Susan.
We look forward to opening up again for programs and in-person socializing in the coming months. And now Tim Phelps, also from the Learning Center, is here to give you some more information about Christian's background. Tim?
Sure, thanks. Christian McBurney is one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. He wrote his first book on the history of Kingston when he was in high school. In college at Brown, he wrote a 300-page undergraduate thesis on colonial South Kingston Planters Society, a document that could easily have served as a PhD thesis and which continues to be consulted by historians today, including myself. He seemed headed for sure for a career as a history professor. But then Senator Claiborne Pell warned a young McBurney on a student trip to Washington that history was a difficult field and he should do something else. So Christian went to law school and is now a tax lawyer and partner in a prominent Washington law firm. But somehow he has managed to be both. In 2015, he started a very successful blog on Rhode Island history. It's called Small State, Big History, that features heavily researched articles by a variety of authors, especially himself. He is the author of 5 books on the Revolution, including 3 on Rhode Island, and the one he will talk about tonight, on the Battle of Rhode Island. Despite growing up in Portsmouth, this is me, where this battle took place, I had no idea until reading his book that this was one of the major battles of the Revolution, even though there was no clear winner. Christian has a new book coming out in June, Dark Voyage, an American privateer's war on Britain's African slave trade. I have had the pleasure of reading an advance copy, and it is both groundbreaking and fascinating. Christian?
Thank you, Tim, and very kind words. That's probably the best introduction I've ever had, so thank you. And thank you, Susan. Glad to be here. And I do acknowledge that I'm founder and publisher of the Rhode Island, probably Rhode Island's leading history blog called Small State, Big History. So if anyone's interested in that, you can contact Tim and he'll put me in touch. But if anyone would like to do an article on William Ellery Channing, I would love it. As a matter of fact, there's a Hall of Fame in New York City, United States Hall of Fame, and there are only 3 Rhode Islanders in it, and one of them is William Ellery Channing. So he was the founder of the Unitarian Church. But I'm here today to talk about the my book, The Rhode Island Campaign, and I'm going to get that up here. Here we are. So here's the book cover. It's called the Rhode Island Campaign. It's not solely about the battle. Rhode Island campaign was broader. I will talk about the broader campaign, although I'll focus more on the battle. But as you can see, it's the first French and American operation in the Revolutionary War. So it's the first time that the French were involved with the Americans in trying to get the Americans to beat the British and gain their independence. Now, the British Army and Navy occupied Newport, Rhode Island for almost 3 years, from December 1776 to October 1779. The key event during that period was the Rhode Island campaign, which culminated in the Battle of Rhode Island on August 29, 1778. Both the campaign and the battle haven't attracted the attention that I think they deserve. Yet the campaign was important. As I said, it was the first time that the French were involved in military operations with the Americans. And while the Allies did not succeed in the campaign, it remains one of the most fascinating campaigns of the entire war. And this is my first book on this topic. The Battle of Rhode Island was also the largest battle in New England. You can name the others: Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill. There's the Battle of Bennington in Vermont, but Battle of Rhode Island was actually the largest one. Now, first, I'm going to set the stage and go through some of the campaigns and give you a flavor. At the time, there were 2 world superpowers. Does that sound familiar? I guess maybe now we have 3. France was still smarting from its humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War and saw an opportunity against its longtime enemy, Great Britain, for revenge when the American Revolution broke out. But King Louis XVI hesitated to openly commit to the Americans until he was sure that the Americans had a chance to win. And that occurred with the stunning American victory at Saratoga in October 1777. On February 6, 1778, with the help of Ben Franklin, France signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. And 2 days later, he appointed Charles Henry Theodot Comte d'Estaing to command a powerful squadron of warships and ordered him to prepare to depart for North America. So here's a picture of d'Estaing and his finery, an aristocrat from France. On April 13, 1778, d'Estaing's squadron of warships departed Toulon, France, in the Mediterranean for North America. He had with him 8 ships of the line, 74 more guns, and 7 other ships. So these ships of the line were the most powerful things afloat. He had 10,000 sailors, Marines, and regular soldiers on board. He knew he only had a small window of opportunity because once Great Britain found out about his sailing to North America, they would send their own fleet. Of course, they had spies in Paris, and matter of fact, in Franklin's own office, so they found out right away. Still, he had some opportunity for a window, for a big victory. But his trip across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic was agonizingly slow. On July 7th, d'Estaing finally reached the Chesapeake Bay, but he missed Admiral Howe's fleet departing Philadelphia. They heard about his coming by 2 weeks. D'Estaing then set its sights on New York, capturing where Howe, the British headquarters were. And that's where Howe had sailed. But he was foiled again. The American pilots told him that his large ships, they could cross sandbars at Sandy Hook in New Jersey, leading to New York Harbor, but at low tide, they wouldn't be able to get out. And he didn't want to take the risk of getting stuck. So the parties all agreed to cooperate with an American army to invade Newport, Rhode Island. And if the British garrison there could be captured, that might end the war. By 1775, Newport had become the 5th most important city in the American colonies, behind, I would argue, in order, can you name them? Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Charleston, South Carolina, and then Newport. Newport had a population of about 9,500 prior to the war and sent out hundreds of ships to engage in domestic and international maritime trade, including, of course, the slave trade. Its population was mostly pro-patriot, and Rhode Island was the first colony to end its allegiance to the British in May 1776. Here's a classic image of the Newport. You can see all the different churches and different denominations. But in December of 1776, a fleet of 71 ships and 7,100 soldiers on board easily captured, British ships easily captured Newport and the rest of Aquidneck Island, as well as Jamestown. There's a image painted in about 1920, with a nice color image. Admiral Howe wanted a port where his ships could spend winter. The British Army wanted to use Newport as a base to attack other places in New England. But the British Army never received reinforcements to act offensively from Newport. So the garrison really wasted 3 years on a defensive mission. Here's a map of Aquidneck Island, of course, the east and west roads being very important. Now, Rhode Island was, they couldn't, militia had to be supported by bigger Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire. There was a serious effort to invade Aquidneck Island in October 1777. It was called Spencer's Expedition. And interestingly, it was a secret expedition. Even the soldiers didn't know where they were going, but it didn't work out. And I actually have a very interesting chapter on that in my book. Another chapter in the book talks about the raids in May of 1778 of Bristol and Warren, where more than 100 buildings were burned. In April 1778, Sir Henry Clinton was appointed commander-in-chief of the British forces. His first step after hearing about the departure of D'Estaing's squadron from France was to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate his forces in New York. He also sent 1,850 troops, British troops, from New York to Newport. Now, the American commander who would cooperate with D'Estaing was Major General John Sullivan. He was of Irish heritage. He was from New Hampshire. He was a former lawyer. He was delegate to the Continental Congress, and he rose to become one of Washington's main generals. But he had a checkered career. He led a column in the Great Victory at Trenton, in New Jersey, but he also was soundly trounced in Long Island and several other battles. Sullivan badgered Washington for an independent command. That's how you gain fame, independent command. Finally, Washington appointed him to the Rhode Island theater. Now, when D'Estaing arrived off of Newport on July 29, he wanted to force the main channel, sail up the main channel, get ready to invade Newport right away. But the Americans were far from ready. Sullivan only had about 2,000 troops at that time on hand, and few of them were Continentals. Continentals were the National Army under George Washington. Then you had state regiments. Each Rhode Island, Massachusetts, for example, had state regiments. Then you had militia who just got called up at the last minute. D'Estaing said he had 4,000 troops on board, but actually he included in that 1,500 sailors. A lot of them never even handled a musket. And they were about to face 6,000 well-trained British, German, and Loyalist troops defending Newport. Normally, when you attack a well-defended town, you need at least 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio. But the Americans and the French didn't have that. The commander of the British forces was Robert Pigott. And we know that because I had been calling General Peugeot for a number of years when I was first researching. When I talked to this one guy historian who read Southern journals, and they often would use phonetic spelling. So it was clearly that his name was spelled Pigott. Now, on July 21, Washington dispatched 2,500 Continentals under the Marquis de Lafayette to march his army from White Plains to Newport. It's a long way. It took some time. The bulk of Sullivan's army would be militia raised by New England states and universal drafts. So there were real drafts in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut. You had to respond or you would get fined. It was a true draft. Washington did send Rhode Island's his best general, best subordinate, and that's Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island. Now, as a result of aggressive French Navy maneuvers in Narragansett Bay, in order to avoid capture, the Royal Navy blew up or scuttled 5 32-gun frigates, 2 14-gun sloops, and 3 armed galleys. And while serving in a Boston artillery regiment at the time in Tiverton, getting ready for the invasion, Paul Revere of the famous Midnight Ride was stationed in Tiverton. Shortly after, one ship exploded in the Middle Channel. Pieces of paper floated down into his camp that were signed by a British Navy captain on one of the ships. Taken together, this loss of warships carrying in total 210 cannon was the most significant loss of British warships in the entire war. That's pretty impressive. Here's a beautiful French map. This is in the Library of Congress, and I held the actual map. And the librarian said, "Be careful, that costs about $2 or $3 million." So I tried not to rip it. It was done by a French engineer named Chesnoy. Now, D'Estaing was frustrated by these American delays, so he decided to sail north up the main channel on August 8th, past Newport. And there was a big, the British cannons were blaring. You can see in the map just outside Newport on Goat Island and Rose Island, coming from the Point District cannon firing at the French ships. But they made it up past north of Newport. You can see them stationed there in the middle square there. And that really scared the British in Newport and Loyalists in Newport. Oh, the French are really, the next day they're going to capture us. Now, the British then scuttled a bunch of their transports, including, of course, the famous Endeavour, Captain James Cook's ship, in between Goat Island and Coast Harbor Island, where the Navy college is, and other places to prevent the French from barging into town. But that wasn't their plan anyway. Now, the plan was for the next day, D'Estaing to land on Midway between up Aquidneck Island. Then the Americans were going to cross Tiverton, and they hoped to trap British soldiers who were at the northern end of Aquidneck Island. But once the French ran the blockade, so to speak, ran up north of Newport, the troops in northern Aquidneck Island got nervous, and they retreated back to the defensive lines around Newport. So that prevented that opportunity to capture those troops. Now, just as D'Estaing was about to, the next day, land on Aquidneck Island, a lookout on D'Estaing's flagship, Languedoc, high on a mast, yelled that he saw in the distance 1, 2, 10, 20, 30 ships. It was Howe's fleet, Admiral Howe's fleet, had come to rescue the Newport garrison. And this shocked D'Estaing. No one expected it. He didn't have any spy ships out. And he ordered all of his troops to return to their ships. Howe had sailed to New York, from New York to Newport. He took a big gamble. He had kind of an eclectic fleet. He didn't have as many powerful ships of the line as the French did, but he had more ships. He was trying to disrupt the siege. Now D'Estaing has a decision. What do I do? Do I go out and chase Howe and fight him, or do I continue with the siege? I argue that he should have continued with the siege for a couple of days more, at least, to see what he could have accomplished. That was his main goal. But D'Estaing decided not to do that. And he had some decent reasons for not doing it as well. So the next morning, D'Estaing decided, I'm going to go out and attack Howe. He recrossed, returned on his sailing up the channel. Now he went out the channel, another barrage of artillery fire on both sides. A great sea battle seemed imminent. Here's a picture of the sea barrage of artillery. So a great sea battle seemed imminent, and you could have seen it from Benton's Reef. A lot of Newporters went there. But instead, Howe turned around and he sailed south. It looked like he was running away, but in fact, he was relieving Newport of the siege. Aquidneck Island is an island, obviously, and whoever controls the water controls Newport. And so by taking the French away, the Americans never had control of the water. The British ships always did. But by sailing away, the Americans lost their, and French lost the control around the Aquidneck Island. The next morning, the fleets maneuvered many miles to the south. And it looked like there was going to be a major battle, but then suddenly a storm turned up. Turned out to be a big hurricane. It was really the most important event of the entire campaign. The hurricane was bad luck for D'Estaing. It foiled his plans. It scattered both fleets, but it hurt the French more. The French, here's a picture of the French flagship, all three masts down. This was one of the most impressive ships in the world at the time. And the British ship was attacking it, but it stopped attacking it at night, and then in the morning, French ships arrived to drive it away. But they attached these what are called jury masts, the top parts of other ships' masts, and were put on the Languedoc. Two other major French ships lost two of their three masts. So D'Estaing gathered the ships, brought his officers aboard his flagship. What should they do? Should they go back to Newport, continue the siege, or should they go to Boston to repair their ships? D'Estaing's, all the officers says, we need to go to Boston right away. We need to give up the siege. So D'Estaing returned to Newport on his way to Boston, gave the news. This infuriated the Americans, of course. At the time, though, the French decision was considered controversial, but in retrospect, it was probably the right move. Now, while D'Estaing had been chasing Howe, General Sullivan was setting siege to Newport. And I have an entire chapter in the book on the siege of Newport. It was one of the few times that the Americans had engaged in real siege operations against the British. They had trenches and approaches, artillery being fired, but they didn't have enough artillery to break the defensive lines of the British outside Newport. Here's a great image of the colorized image of the siege, and it's one of the only ones that's in color that I know of. There might be one other one. I actually own it. Oh man, I got lucky. I got lucky on eBay. And you can see in the foreground, there's some American farmers, they're Newport farmers with their floppy hats. There's British soldiers in red. You can see the tents in the middle. On the left is Mantomi Hill, more tents. These are the British lines. And on the right, that's where the Americans are firing their artillery or getting fired at. They were on Honeyman Hill. So nice image, but it's not the Battle of Rhode Island. It's actually the siege of Rhode Island. Now, during this terrible storm, the same storm that hit the ships also hit Newport. And the Americans were in their tents and they all blew down. They got soaking wet. They tried to, ones they could, ran into buildings, but there wasn't enough room. I read about some soldiers who straddled fence posts to keep out of puddles while they slept. Can you imagine that? But the army, the storm ended and the army survived. Now, the American militia and volunteers believed that to charge the British front lines in a frontal assault would be insane. They all knew that their best hope was to have the French fleet land behind Newport, like, Brenton Reef or something like that, where they didn't have the great defensive fortifications. But that wasn't happening anymore. The French fleet wasn't there. So the New Englanders and Rhode Islanders and other New Englanders had no intention, who were volunteers, had no intention of charging head on the front line. So a lot of them started leaving. Now they were volunteers, so technically it wasn't desertion, but this was no way to run an army. Sullivan realized that his chance for glory had been dashed, and he insulted the French in public orders, not once, but twice, and then in a letter to D'Estaing. D'Estaing, trying to avoid a rupture between the Allies, offered a great reply. Sullivan's insults, he wrote, had imposed on him the painful but necessary law of profound silence. I applied that principle to a recent family gathering to great effect, so I encourage you to do the same. Now, I'll set stage for the Battle of Rhode Island starts really back in Valley Forge, which I'm sure many of you heard of. One of the key goals for Britain was to suppress the rebellion by defeating the American army before it could develop into a national army that could stand toe-to-toe with the British regulars. Continental soldiers had gained vital experience at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown outside of Philadelphia and at Saratoga. Then at Valley Forge, which is the winter encampment in Pennsylvania of 1777 to 1778, a number of soldiers died. It was difficult suffering, but also a number were trained. They were trained properly by Baron von Steuben, and they got better and better. Washington's new army saw its first test at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey in late June 1778. The British wanted to retreat from Philadelphia. They knew the French could maybe attack them there, so they wanted to centralize their forces in New York City. But during the retreat, Washington wanted to attack the rear of the British Army, and Major General Charles Lee did that. And this was a topic of one of my books called The Outrageous Treason of Major General Charles Lee, which I think he did when he was a prisoner, but then he was released and he took over this half of Washington's army. And also the unfair court-martial of Lee, because I actually think he did a good job at the Battle of Monmouth, even though he was court-martialed. But what was surprising was that the American army performed very well. It was kind of a draw, but the American army definitely had increased its effectiveness and discipline. I'm going to highlight Jackson's detachment. Here's Henry Jackson of Boston. It was a proud regiment. A lot of it's in Jackson's detachment of Continentals. A lot of its officers were sons of wealthy Boston merchants or Boston lawyers. They definitely sought glory on the battlefield. but at the battle, excuse me. That's not water, but it's still good. At the Battle of Monmouth, the regiment's courage had been questioned. Its commander, Jackson, had retreated without orders. It was a confusing battle, the most interesting of the war. And at one point, Charles Lee, the Major General, number 2 to Washington, lost his temper, said, "Where's that blue regiment going?" And he even put his hand on the sword as he approached Jackson. Jackson explained the situation, and he was threatened with court-martial. So a lot of Jackson's officers were very ashamed of this. So they actually wanted him to be court-martialed. But Sullivan said, "Look, we're about to get into a battle in Rhode Island here. We're not going to do that." Now, on August 28th, Sullivan received intelligence that a British force from Long Island under Sir Henry Clinton, about 4,000 on Royal Navy ships, was off of Long Island. They were ready to sail to Aquidneck Island. Their plan was, we're going to land at the northern part of Aquidneck Island, and we're going to cut off the Americans and trap them on the island. Sullivan and his officers unanimously agreed to retreat to the northern part of Aquidneck Island. They could just wait for the French. They were hoping the French would return from Boston. Of course, that wasn't really practical. But if Clinton arrived, they could then slip over to Tiverton. That evening, Sullivan ordered his troops to retreat from their offensive positions outside of the British defensive lines. One Rhode Island militiaman recalled during the retreat, "A hogshead of rum was placed near our line of march with head out to refresh the troops as they passed. But with the troops staying so long by it and concerned about the enemy following, it was thought best for safety to turn it over." Must have been a bummer to see that rum go to waste. But the troops did retreat that night. It was pretty extraordinary. The British didn't realize what was going on. And by about 2 or 3 in the morning, the American army had occupied the defensive works at Butts Hill. So you've heard a lot about Butts Hill. There's some great restoration work going on there by a group focused just on that. Here's a British image of it. You can see 2 parts to it. The middle part was where the British troops would have been stationed. Now, of course, the fort was focused on attack from the north, but now the attack would be coming from the south. Now, when General Pickett woke up the next morning, he was informed that the Americans had left their lines, and he turned aggressive, and he ordered his troops to assemble. he sought to punish Sullivan's army as it retreated. He hoped to attack it while it was trying to get off the island. He sent 1,100 British regular troops up the East Road under British General Francis Smith, and 1,800 Hessian and Loyalist regulars up the West Road under a German General von Lossberg. Of course, the Germans were allies of the British, and basically the British had hired them. I've got a bunch of maps here. So I had, unfortunately, these maps are not yet in the book. I'm hoping to come up with a new version of the book that will have the maps. But I have 10 battle maps for your pleasure here. So here's 6:30 a.m. showing the American lines. You can see Butts Hill at the top there, and Quaker Hill. You can see some American regiments there. And Livingston's advance guard, Jackson's detachment, is at Union Street and East Main Road. That's near the Portsmouth Circle site. You can see Wade's regiment there, some part of Wade's regiment there. And on the west side, you have Lawrence's advance guard. Sullivan had at his disposal about 7,000 infantrymen and 775 artillerymen. Only about 2,200 were Continentals. Those were the most disciplined troops. About 1,550 were members of Massachusetts and Rhode Island state regiments. They had a little more experience than militia. The least experienced were just the militia. And militia were just called up at the last minute. They showed up for a month or so. So they had some training, but especially in Massachusetts, but not a lot. The bulk of Sullivan was well represented with the artillerymen. The artillery got a lot of experience in the siege, so that was helpful for them. Washington also sent some officers to help out to lead the Americans on Aquidneck Island, and they included John Lawrence. He was the son of Henry Lawrence, who was the president of the Continental Congress at the time. Henry Lawrence was also probably the leading slave trader in colonial times in North America. So not a great title, but his son was very interesting. He was well educated. He was educated in France. He could speak French. And later in 1779, 1780, he tried to persuade his home state of South Carolina to do something that Rhode Island did, to allow slaves to join a regiment and earn their freedom that way and fight on the American side. But despite valiant attempts, he did not succeed. There was also Colonel Henry Livingston of New York was there. Both of them, Lawrence and Livingston, had fought at the Battle of Monmouth, and they both had led advanced units, so they had experience with that. Here's you can see this next map. Pickett's troops are now marching. Some up the East Road, some up the West Road. You can see the 38th and 54th Flank companies of Grenadiers and Light Infantry, the 22nd Regiment and the 43rd Regiment. And the Royal Artillery was behind them. Now, proceeding up the West Road, you can see German chasseurs, very good troops, 2 other German regiments under Lossberg. When you look at armies, you want to know how is their training. The British are very well trained, experienced troops. The Americans not quite as much, but they caught up quite a bit with von Steuben and at Valley Forge. Really, it's more important is experience. What's the experience in battle? It's a real shock to be in battle. So the more experience you have, the better. Oftentimes it's said, well, the British had a lot more experience. Excuse me. We're getting into allergy season. They often said that the British had a lot more experience, but actually the French and Indian War, most of their battles ended in 1759. They had a few veterans from there, but not many. Some of the 43rd Regiment did fight at Bunker Hill, got hit pretty hard. 38th Regiment also at Bunker Hill and Brandywine, so they had some good experience. But the 22nd Regiment didn't have any experience. The American side, the Rhode Island 2nd Regiment, had substantial battlefield experience. The 1st Canadian was there. It had a little bit at Saratoga, and some of the Massachusetts regiments had been at Saratoga, but not really in the battle. So now some of the Massachusetts militia had been at Lexington and Concord, so that helped. So it looks like the British had the edge in experience, but not by a whole lot. Here's a grenadier British soldier. They were among the elites, so they were going up the east road. So here's the East Road first. Sullivan had brought about 950 troops forward. At Union Street was a company of Massachusetts state troops under Wade, Nathaniel Wade. And one of our attendees here has a descendant who was in Wade's regiment. Now, this was only part of Wade's regiment, so it's not certain that his descendant was here. But this was a very key ambush right here. The British were marching up the East Road. They didn't send out flanking units, flankers to determine who, if there are any Americans hiding. And then at the last minute before they got to Union Street, the 22nd Regiment veered off toward Union Street. They wanted to go up the middle road. Suddenly, 90 troops in Wade's regiment sprung up from behind the stone wall there, fired a volley, very effective volley, right point blank range in the 22nd Regiment. And they even got off a second volley. So outstanding work. And it really hurt the 22nd Regiment quite a bit. Lieutenant John Campbell was the lieutenant colonel. He was the head of the regiment. He had 5 bullet holes in his vest without getting hit. Amazing. But his regiment suffered more killed and wounded that day than any other regiment in the field. 13 dead, 58 wounded. You could see to the north, Quaker Hill was the next position. So you can see after the ambush here, Jackson's detachment and Livingston's advance guard started to retreat back up towards Quaker Hill. That was going to be the next position. Now, Jackson's detachment was going north, and in the confusion, the British 43rd Regiment followed it, but they thought that Jackson's regiment was the Von Hein Regiment. Let me see if we have that. They wore blue coats. They said, oh, these are the Germans. They were our allies, but they weren't the allies. So Jackson's regiment turned around and fired a very devastating volley into the 43rd Regiment. Now Jackson's detachment and Livingston's advance guard, they made it safely up to Quaker Hill, where Wigglesworth's regiment was, and some pickets. And then suddenly the Americans had the numerical advantage, and they turned around and charged at the British column. There was one artillery piece they wanted to capture. And at the head of this charge was Major Louis Toussard. He was a member of Lafayette's staff. Very brave man, but he charged an artillery piece on horseback, and he wound up getting wounded in several different places, and his horse fell off his horse. He did survive, and he later got a pension from the Continental Congress. Then the British started pouring more men, getting closer to Quaker Hill, so the tide turned, and the British counterattack drove the Americans away, and they captured their artillery piece. Seeing more British reinforcements arrive at Quaker Hill, General Sullivan sent a messenger to order Wigglesworth's, Livingston's, and Jackson to retreat back to the main lines at Butts Hill. The messenger was none other than Colonel John Trumbull, the future painter of Revolutionary War scenes. Here's a self-portrait. Whoops. Now, as he rode forward, Trumbull had cannonballs bounce near him. Musket balls were hitting in the dirt, but he survived. He arrived at Colonel Wigglesworth's side and passed along a message for Wigglesworth to retire. Wigglesworth wanted to remain, but then he was warned. He said, well, I've got reinforcements coming over there. And actually, those were the blue-coated, they were not blue-coated Continentals, they were the von Hoyne Regiment. So for the second time in a row, the Hessian von Hoyne Regiment caused confusion. The Americans continued to repel the counterattacks at Quaker Hill. And that's where right now there's a cannon at Quaker Hill, kind of representing where that was, for about 30 minutes. And finally, General Smith organized an attack by about 1,000 British troops under his command. And they were, the advance guard was definitely overmatched, so they retreated. There was Sullivan's Life Guard, was a small unit of Rhode Islanders. They suffered terribly, about 2 were killed and 5 wounded. Americans retreated to avoid the bayonets. The British claimed that they ran precipitously down Quaker Hill toward their lines, but Trumbull and Sullivan and others said it was a orderly retreat, probably in between the two. So as the American advance units streamed back to the American lines, here they are running or moving quickly and going through the defensive lines that have been set up. Excuse me. It was a crucial time, but sometimes that's when the defenders panic. Oh, they're retreating. I see all these experienced British troops coming at us with bayonets fixed. Maybe we better retreat too. But that's not what happened. The Americans' line held. Now, General Smith, the British general, had a decision to make. He had hoped to keep the Americans off guard, but that didn't happen. And he had 2,000 British troops left behind in Newport as a reserve. But the main goal was to hold Newport. So he decided, looking at the strong American positions at Butts Hill, to not attack. So the rest of the day was pretty much an artillery duel. The action on the East Road, the Americans suffered 122 casualties, including 14 killed. The British had 130 casualties and 19 killed. I came across a Rhode Island militiaman whose pension application said he had fired during this battle 67 times. Can you imagine that? The action on the West Road has drawn a lot more attention, but there were actually more casualties on the East Road. Moreover, the Americans had performed very well at Union Street and on Quaker Hill. All right, now let's turn to the west side. We're going back to 7 a.m. And you can see Talbot here. This is Major Silas Talbot. He's the future captain of the USS Constitution. He had a very small advance guard there, and he was attacked by Malmesbury chasseurs. So he retreats back to, you can see where Lawrence's advance guard is. This occurred near the Redwood House, near the Overing House as well. And that's where General Richard Prescott was captured. That's the subject of my book called Kidnapping the Enemy, where Prescott was captured at that house, and he was with the intent of exchanging him for Charles Lee, who was captured in New Jersey. At one point, the chasseurs were running after Talbot. Some of the Americans had hid in a cornfield, and as the Germans were running by, they sprang up and fired a volley, and they seriously injured a bunch of troops, including a Captain Otinius. Here's Malmesbury. He wrote a very informative diary of this day in Newport, and also headed his troops during this battle. Piggott heard the signs of the battle, and he sent up the von Hoyne Regiment and the King's American Regiment. Those were Loyalists who had green coats. So Lossberg now had 1,800 soldiers on the West Road. Lawrence advanced unit, he only had 300. So here's again, Lawrence is, part of the service of being in the advanced units is to tire out the attackers, delay them, so that the main defensive lines are repaired. And that's what Lawrence did. He fell back nearly 3 miles to south base of Turkey Hill. He sent a request to Sullivan for reinforcements. Hey, send me reinforcements, I can hold these guys. But Sullivan instead sent orders to Lawrence to retreat back to the main lines west of Butts Hill. He did send forward Webb's regiment of Connecticut Continentals to help him retreat as a cover. So you can see here the various regiments are attacking Lawrence's advance guard, which is retreating, and Webb's regiment there is retreating, but also providing some cover. Lawrence was on a green coat, sitting on a horse the whole time, exposed to fire, but he was not hurt. Now, the American right wing was commanded by Major General Nathaniel Greene, who was Washington's best subordinate and later would gain fame in the Southern campaigns. His line extended 1/2 mile from Butts Hill to Durfee's Hill to the west. And the key position to anchor the line was the artillery redoubt on Durfee's Hill. Here's the redoubt, and you can see it's facing northwards. You would expect, because the British expected that, and the opening was to the south to Newport. But now the Americans are going to hold that, and they're trying to hold off the British to the south. It was manned by an extraordinary regiment, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Consisted of about 140 soldiers. Most of them were former Rhode Island slaves who obtained their freedom by enlisting in the Rhode Island Regiment. This had occurred in February 1778. Rhode Island was short of troops, and they decided to, if a black slave agreed, and the master had to really agree too, to join the Continental Army, and they had to enlist for the remainder of the war, then the enslaved man would be free. About 90 enslaved people, men, did this. There were others in the regiment too, men of color, free blacks, Native Americans, Narragansetts, coconuts. I looked at an incomplete list of 33 of the enslaved soldiers, and 8 of them, or 25%, had been born in Africa. So in their lifetimes, they were captured in Africa, brought to the coast, sold to a slave ship, probably British, possibly Rhode Island, brought to America and enslaved, and now they were fighting in a Continental Army for the freedom of the United States as well as for their own freedom. So pretty extraordinary. This is a drawing from about 1781 by a French officer on the trip to Yorktown from Newport. The soldiers they were enlisted. They had various gatherings where they were trained, and they got good uniforms. You can see the uniforms here, nice white uniforms, and they were well accoutred, especially at the beginning. Now, unlike their white counterparts, they had not previously been allowed to, handle muskets and be trained by militia as militiamen. So they had a long way to go. But they, and also this was their first test in battle. They just joined in February, March, some in May, even in June. But now they're at the forefront. They're at the advanced redoubt. Now the other American troops are there too. You can see the redoubt there in the middle, but there are other American troops outside as well, and they're firing their muskets. Malmesbury tried to take the artillery route, but he was beaten back. He wrote in his journal that he found obstinate resistance in the redoubt, which was filled chiefly with wild-looking men in their shirt sleeves, and among them many Negroes. So that's real evidence that the Black Regiment was in that redoubt, defending strongly. About 12 noon, Malmesbury tried again with more of his troops. This time he coordinated with some British ships that were in the Middle Channel. There was the Vigilant. It was a gunboat carrying 14 24-pounders, just huge ships. This Vigilant was just a floating battery, huge 24-pounders. Uh, but it turned out it didn't do much, didn't have much effect on the Americans, and Nathaniel Greene sent some artillery pieces to the shoreline, 18-pounders, and they drove the British ships away. You can see them here attacking the various British ships. So after two, Lossberg was going to try attempts. Lossberg was going to try once more. And this was going to be the main charge. You can see the 1st Ansbach Regiment, 2nd, the von Hoyen, King's American Regiment, and Malsburg Chasseurs, all in the charge. This was going to be the one last big charge. And you can see here, the actually, let's see, let me see here. I'm going the wrong way here. Whoops. You can see the von Hoyen Regiment, it actually got behind the redoubt there. So they actually got 100 yards beyond the redoubt. So that must have disturbed the defenders quite a bit. But the Americans kept firing and firing, and the German soldiers felt like they were being fired on all sides. They suppressed their fire. Suddenly they panicked and retreated. They left some of their dead on the ground. Greene then saw his chance. He sent forward a fresh part of Jackson's detachment and other Continental troops. Then he sent forward a fresh brigade of 850 militiamen led by Colonel John Trumbull, who marched forward as militiamen. They performed very, very well. And that was pretty much it for the attack by the British. Sullivan now had a choice, American general. Should he order an advance against the retreating Lossberg's troops, or should he just stay where he is? Greene had earlier said, hey, Sullivan, let's get in a general engagement, a wide battle. But Sullivan declined to. His main goal was to get his troops off the island safely. It wasn't going to be practical to take over Newport at this point, especially with Clinton's troops on their way. So he decided, no, we're just going to stay where we are. And Greene thought that was the right decision afterwards. The battle was over. The British had suffered more casualties, 260 with 38 killed, 210 wounded, and 12 missing. The Americans had 211 casualties with 30 dead, 137 wounded, and 44 missing. The next day, Sullivan received word from Washington that a British expeditionary force had left and was on its way to Rhode Island. I won't go into details of that, and as many other details are in the book. But the next night, the entire American army and their artillery equipment got off Aquidneck Island and got to Tiverton. You can see in the lower right here, the ships, all manned by Rhode Island boatmen, taking the army off Aquidneck Island onto Tiverton. And actually, they used to say that, oh, not a man was left, but I actually did find a man was left. He had fallen asleep and he was captured, but he was let go shortly afterwards. Here's a closer view of the American map of the retreat. Here's Lafayette had a sword made for him for this. He was horrified that he missed the battle. Actually, he was in Boston trying to persuade the Stang to come back and help out. When he heard that the battle was going on, he quickly rode to Aquidneck Island, but he was late. But he did help to do the retreat. So this is his sword. He's got this emblazoned on his sword.
Christian, why don't we wind up soon so we can take a few questions?
Yeah, I'm just about there. So overall, the Rhode Island campaign had been a failure for the Americans. It was the first joint Allied effort to seize Newport, did not succeed. But as with the the Battle of Monmouth, the Americans actually fought very well. The Continentals did a good job. Jackson's detachment, remember how they had suffered embarrassment in Monmouth. They did a great job here at the Battle of Rhode Island. The artillery had been effective, even and the militia had performed well too. So it was a good sign. Here is the memorial to the black enslaved men who fought at the Battle of Rhode Island. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, consisting mostly of the former slaves, had held the artillery redoubt. They had performed very well, especially considering they'd never been in battle. There was a rumor that they did not perform well, but Sullivan came out with an announcement that said that denying that had happened. Now, the officers in Continental, it was similar to what they had said about the Battle of Monmouth. After Monmouth, the British general was quoted as saying, Continentals had administered a very handsome flogging on His Majesty's troops, and gentlemen may now be convinced that the Americans can and will fight. And after the Battle of Rhode Island, Nathaniel Greene boasted to Washington, I had the pleasure to see enemy regulars run in worse disorder than they did at the Battle of Monmouth. So it was a strong performance. I think that after Monmouth and Rhode Island, General Clinton was very wary of attacking the Continentals in the north. And this was actually the last big battle in the north, Rhode Island. In ending, I'll quote the last words of Lieutenant Richard Walker of Jackson's detachment, who was severely wounded in the hip in the action on the east side. In the night after the battle, surrounded by his fellow officers, he was asked if he was in great pain. He replied, I am a soldier of the States and feel no pain in the service of my country. Being very thirsty, he called for a glass of wine, drank to his friends around him, and wished them a longer service to their country than he had. And he soon after died. Thank you.
That's terrific, Christian. As much as I've read about this battle, particularly in your book, I learned a lot more tonight. Those maps were very helpful, and your talk was very helpful. Folks, we're running a little later than usual, but if you like, we'll take some questions, and you can put your questions in the chat, or possibly you can raise your hand if I'm able to see you. I'd like to mention that we're honored tonight to have with us a descendant of General Nathaniel Greene, Kate Greene. So Kate, thank you very much for being here. I get to ask the first question. So Christian, what do you think if the American army had been defeated and captured, what would have been the impact on the war? In reverse, if Newport had been taken and the British army had been defeated, presumably much earlier when the French fleet was there, what would have been the impact of the war that way?
Well, maybe if the French and Americans had been able to capture Newport and capture an army of 6,000 men, that might have ended the war. Probably not, but it's basically that's what happened at Yorktown. So it was definitely possible. If the American army had been totally defeated, that would have been a real blow to the Continental cause. Hard to say what would have happened. Probably would have extended the war for a number of more years.
But if the Americans and French had won, that might have ended the war a couple of years earlier, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Let's see. Do we know how many enslaved people won their freedom through the Revolutionary War service?
Well, about 90 signed up, and we're at the Battle of Rhode Island, and the Rhode Island General Assembly kind of cut it off. As part of the deal, the enslaved men got their freedom, but the masters got paid compensation. So I think Rhode Island didn't want to have a big liability, so they cut that off in June. But actually, more enslaved men joined. So I think it was probably about 120 got their freedom.
And
Now,
as I
you
remember,
might say there were about three, interesting question. Oh, why weren't there more? It's often said that soldiers constitute about 10% of the population. Obviously, women are 50%. In those days, women didn't fight. And then children versus elderly men. So you're left with about 10% of the population. But I don't have a population of about 3,000. Not all were enslaved, but most were. So there wasn't a huge 10% of that. It's a little over 300, probably less than that if you're talking about just enslaved men. So not a lot of to choose to pick from.
as I recall, those men who did ultimately win their freedom had to serve for 5 years, longer than perhaps
Well-
any white person served.
Yeah, most of the whites who enlisted for a number of years, 3 years. A few enlisted for the duration of the war. They weren't the intelligent ones, but the enslaved men had to enlist for the duration of the war in order to gain their freedom. Now, if they got wounded, after year 2, or that would be sufficient. They could be discharged at that point.
So our friend Witt from earlier asked, how close to Butts Hill Fort did they fight? Did they get to the fort, or were the Brits held back just below?
It's a good question. No, there was no fighting at Butts Hill. That was where Sullivan had his headquarters, so he was able to, from that great vantage point, see both the action on the east side and on the west side. And as I said earlier, there is a group that's looking to restore Butts Hill Fort, doing a great job. It's got incredible bones, so it's going to be really outstanding when that restoration work is done. But just before the British, they arrived with their bayonets, they were going to charge the lines next to Butts Hill, but then they held off.
So Reverend Andy Akers asks, what was the impact of this battle in convincing the British to not make any further offensives in New England?
Well, the British didn't have much to do with New England after that. Part of the Clinton's troops that came to Rhode Island, they were too late, so they went to New Bedford and sacked New Bedford, burned a bunch of buildings, and then they went to Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and took a bunch of sheep. But other than that, there wasn't much action in the New England. They were pretty much holed up in New York City, and the action was mostly in the South after that part of the war. I think the battle helped to persuade Clinton he's not going to win in the North. Let's move to the South. But he didn't succeed there either. Thanks in large part to Nathaniel Greene.
Witt again would like to know, did General Sullivan go on to lead or win or at Yorktown?
His main command after that was actually to lead a attack on the Iroquois in northern
I was just going
New
to
York.
ask you that.
Yeah, it was 1779. The Iroquois had been allied with the British. They kept out of the war for a lot of the war, but then they started to become more active, raiding American settlements. And so Sullivan led the troops that burned a lot of their villages, and that's how you really hurt Indian communities, is by burning their villages and their stores of corn. And that's what Sullivan did.
Christian, I have a personal question on behalf of myself and my brother. I was very interested to see that it looked like there was quite a bit of fighting on the middle road at Union Street there. And as you know, because you've been there, our Phelps family farm is right near that spot. So do you think we could expect that there was fighting on the farm there?
Yeah, I think so. You might want to get out your metal detector. Maybe you'll find some musket balls. I have met some metal detectorists, and I even have in my possession some musket balls that they found near Quaker Hill. probably from supplies of the British help. But there are a lot of cannonballs were found around Portsmouth Abbey that the British had fired from. And so that was very interesting. And Portsmouth Historical Society also has some in its display, some cannonballs and musket balls that were found locally.
The cannonballs at Portsmouth Abbey, would they have been from the ships then, or from?
I think mostly from the ships. Yeah.
So we have another question. Did the citizens of occupied Newport have any impact on either the battle or the siege?
Not really. I mean, they were suffering. Unfortunately, the British burned about 20 houses to the north of Newport, trying to improve their sight lines. So there was a lot of suffering in that from those people, and there were a lot of people worried that the battle might, they might be invaded, and in the middle of a battle, we know what's going on there in Ukraine, how that can be. But they that didn't happen. Fortunately for them, I guess.
But I think you did mention that there was American loyalists who were participated in the battle, loyalists from Newport.
Well, there were a couple of Loyalist regiments. They
Yeah.
came from Connecticut, New York, not necessarily Rhode Island, but there were also Loyalist civilians, like Mary Olney. She has a very good diary of her experience in the war when she was with her children, and her husband was actually on the American side. So very interesting. John Hattendorf came out with a book redoing that diary recently.
My understanding is that most of the civilians who stayed in Newport during the British occupation were loyalists, or at least started out as loyalists. The occupation was so bitter, and the civilians were so mistreated that many of them may not have been loyalists by the time the British left.
Yeah,
So-
I think a lot of them were either loyalists or neutrals, but the British, tore down. They were patriot houses. There's no one living. They would just take the wood off them. Pretty soon there wouldn't be a house left anymore. So they're burning the wood for fuel and for cooking. So it was tough in that regard.
So Christian, this has been fascinating. As I said, I thought I knew a lot about this, and I learned an awful lot more tonight. So thank you very much, and thank you, all of you, for
Hey, Tim.
joining us.
Tim, could I just put in a plug for my most recent book?
Oh,
And you
please, yes, I was going to do
mentioned
that.
Yeah, it might just spur some interest because it is a fascinating topic. The name of it is An American Privateer Attacks the Britain's African Slave Trade. So this is about an American privateer primarily owned by John Brown of Providence, but it's fitted out in Newport, sails to the West African coast and attacks the British slave trade fort, and captures some British slave trade ships. It's a fascinating story. They come across some Rhode Islanders who were in Africa slave trading. They capture some local British people who help them out, actually kind of commit treason against Britain, but they're so desperate to make money in the slave trade that they're happy to do it. Another part of the part of the book is American privateers capturing British slave ships on their just about to arrive in the British Caribbean, because most of the slave trade was British, and they were going to the sugar plantations in Jamaica and other places in the Caribbean. The American privateers captured so many ships that the British slave merchants in Britain reduced their investment in the slave trade, and probably resulted, I think, in about 60,000 enslaved Africans not being brought over. On the other hand, if you're a privateer, what do? You're making money, so they would sell the enslaved captives they found on board the ships to the French. So it's a interesting story. As Tim said, it's pretty groundbreaking. No one has written about it before. So that should be coming out in a couple of months.
We look forward to it, and I'd really recommend it to everyone. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks for coming.
Good to see everyone. Thank you for coming.
Yes, good talk. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.